All right. I don't know if this mic is on or not, but hopefully y'all can hear me. My name is Cecil Phillip, and we're going to talk about building microservices with Dapr, right? So quick show of hands. How many of you have been building microservices or microservice curious? Just kind of want to learn how this stuff works? Yeah? Kind of, sort of, a little bit? Okay. How many of you have heard about Dapr before at all? How many of you are using Dapr in production at all? I expected that. Okay. So what we're going to do is, there's going to be some demos, there's going to be some code samples and some fun stuff, and hopefully at the end of this you'll understand like what Dapr is and what you can do with it, and some of the different things that it kind of provides you as people that want to build like distributed systems and microservices and things of that nature. One of the things that I like about Dapr, before I actually really start to get into it, is, it's really about the patterns, right? And the patterns are really what's important, right? I say that because a lot of times folks are like, oh, okay, I'm not building microservices, I can't use messaging, I can't use service discovery, I can't use like all of these other different types of things. And that's not really the case. At least I don't believe that's the case, right? Like you don't have to be using Kubernetes to be building microservices, right? Like you don't have to be using, specific types of technology if you just want to use some of these patterns in type of your apps, right? So the main thing I want you to get out of here is the patterns, right? The patterns are what is important. Like most of my demos are going to be in .NET. Doesn't matter. Could be Python, could be Go, could be whatever it is that you want it to be, right? Again, the thing that's important is really about the patterns. So let's kind of dive into this really quick. So what's holding microservice development back? Now, one of the things that I always tell folks, as you're looking to build microservices, you're looking to build like these distributed applications, what you have to start doing is now, hey, I have to think about, well, what are the components that I need to put together? Like, what are those puzzle pieces that I need to complete my task, right? And then as you look out into the community, you're gonna find tons of different services and components and all kinds of different things that'll help you get your job done. So again, if we think about message brokers, like how many of you can name more than like 2 or 3 message brokers? It's tons of them, right? There's RabbitMQ, there's RocketMQ, there's Azure Service Bus, like you have tons of different options, right? You have tons of different things for caching, you have tons of different things that help you do configuration and service discovery, right? But choice is great, but then choices also work, right? Because now I have to figure out like what's the right combination of tools for me to build my application, to solve my problem, right? To build my solution, right? I like to call it like the microservice matrix, right? Because for the more things that you want to do, the more combinations of things you have to try and put together, right? And like, what's the thing that's going to support our infrastructure? Like the operating systems that I'm building on or publishing to, right? The apps, the platforms that I'm running, right? Does it have a Python SDK? Does it have a Go SDK? Does it have a .NET SDK? Is it maintained? Is it open source? Is a company, does someone else build it, right? Like I have to sit down, I have to think about all these different things, right? Because when your app goes out, like you have to support that, right? Like you have to stand by that decision and stand by your customers and make sure that you maintain that level of quality, right? And that takes work, right? And then where do you find the time to do this? We talked about time earlier today, right? And optimizing your time. Like where do you find the time to do this, right? Like am I gonna sit down and go through every single message broker to try and figure out, well, is this a right fit? Am I gonna go through every single database or every single option to try and figure out, is this a right fit for the thing that I'm trying to build? That doesn't really make sense for a lot of us. Again, we burn a lot of time doing that. And so this is where Dapr kind of comes in a little bit, right? What it does is that it gives us an abstraction over a lot of the things that are common for people that are building microservices. So again, think about microservices, you think about distributed systems, like what are the things that you want to do, right? I have state stores. I have, again, messaging. Messaging is a big thing when I think about integrating the separate applications, right? I have service discovery. Like all these are different things that we want to try and do. But now what Dapr does, like I said, it gives us like a very portable, lightweight runtime that you could use right next to any application that you're building, any application that speaks HTTP or gRPC, any type of programming language that you want to use. And it gives you the option and the flexibility to kind of build microservices the way that you want to build them with the tools that you're using in a way that makes sense for you. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit. So these are some of the things that Dapr provides. So like I mentioned before, if you're building on any type of relatively modern stack, I'm very sure the programming languages you all are using today can speak HTTP. Is anyone using a programming language that doesn't speak HTTP? I hope not, unless you're doing like assembly or something like that, but then I'm sure even then you could figure it out, right? But Dapr, what it does is that it uses standards, right? It's not based on any proprietary, frameworks or any proprietary technology. It uses the standards that we're all familiar with. So here we're talking about HTTP, which again, a lot of us speak, gRPC. When it comes to some of these other options that are at the bottom, it works with things like open telemetry, again, like open standards. We talk about things like AMQP, again, open standards, right? Like not proprietary to any cloud, to any vendor, to any company, right? Like wherever you want to use it, however you want to use it, like that's the great thing about Dapr. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. Like I mentioned before, like it runs on whatever language that you want to use, right? Go, Java, Python, there's official supported frameworks for them. There's a lot of community supported things for them. It's open source. As of, I want to say earlier this year, it's a part of the CNCF, right? If folks are familiar with the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So that means that, again, like the community is very much involved in the building of this thing, which is really cool, right? And again, at the bottom, you can see here, like it's run on pretty much like any cloud, right? Or you can even run it in a hybrid model, right? It's not a thing that like needs to be in a particular place. Wherever you want to put it, it'll go with you, right? So if you want to run it on Kubernetes, if you want to run it on premises. I'm running it on my laptop right now for part of the demo, not the whole demo. But I'm running on my laptop right now. You can see what it actually feels like to build, debug, and deploy applications using Dapr, right? All right, so let's kind of talk about like what are some of these built-in best practices? Like what are some of the things that it gives you like out of the box, right? So resiliency is a big thing, right? For any of you that are even just building regular web applications, have you ever run into like transient errors? You know what transient errors are? Yeah? Like where randomly like the network fails you. And we all know like the network, you can't trust the network, right? So what do? We build in retries, right? We're building these redundancies to help us, keep the lights on, right? To help us keep going, right? Well, Dapr, as of the most recent version, now has like resiliency built into the framework. Obviously, you could add your own or your language-specific one if you want to, but you don't really have to because it's kind of just in there, right? We think about security, right? Like end-to-end passing of messages back and forth, right? We have MTLS supported in there. Again, and you don't have to do anything. It just automatically does it, right? Observability is another big thing that's in the box too, right? We talked about open telemetry. Like, how do I know where my stuff is going? How can I get my metrics, my monitoring, and also my tracing? Right? And how can I push it out to, I don't know, maybe using Datadog or you're using application insights. Maybe some of y'all are using New Relic or, name your thing of choice. It's because we're supporting these open standards, like Dapr just kind of lights up and it just kind of works for how it works. Now, the cool thing about Dapr, right, like I talked about it creating abstractions. Now, with abstractions, there must be a thing behind the abstraction to make it work, right? If I'm having abstractions for messaging and some of these different types of things, like what's the thing that's actually going to be implementing it on the other side, right? And it turns out like we have tons of different components that the community's created. Dapr came out of Microsoft. Microsoft created like 6 of these, and then all of the other ones have come from everyone else, right? Like the folks from HashiCorp have contributed like support for Vault and some of these other things. The AWS folks have added support for DynamoDB, and there's Firebase support, and again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The great thing about that is, as a developer, the only thing I need to know about is how to talk to Dapr. I don't need to know what the underlying implementation of any of these things are, right? And what do you think that gives me? That's a trick question. What do you think that gives me, right? That gives me the ability to focus on doing the work that I really want to do. So I could swap any of these things out from the back end, and from an application perspective, my code doesn't have to change. I don't have any SDKs that are specific to any of these implementations. That means that I don't have any additional NPM packages or Ruby gems or NuGet packages from .NET, right? All I need to know is how to speak to Dapr, and Dapr will figure it out, right? Which is kind of like a little bit of magic, right? And we'll talk about how that magic works. So sidecars. This is kind of the way that Dapr makes some of this magic work. Have you all ever heard about sidecars? Or familiar how the sidecar pattern works, right? Like I have a process, right? Like my application, and for every instance of my application, I have another process that's sitting next to it. It's kind of like if you ever think about like those motorbikes that have like the little caboose, is that what you call them, cabooses? Like the thing that's attached to it, right? The sidecar, right? Like it kind of goes along with it, right? But for every motorcycle, like there's, like the sidecar, it's attached to it, right? It's like its buddy, like again, like running like a buddy system. So if I have service A and I have service B, not for every service, but for every instance of the service. So if I have 20 copies of service A, I have 20 copies of service B, I'm going to have 40 copies of Dapr. We all did math, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Right? I'm going to have 20 of this one and 20 of that one, right? Because it's going to recognize what these things are, and what it'll do is that it'll be able to find each other on the network, right? Not my app, but Dapr. Dapr will be able to find itself, like instances of itself across the network, depending on what you're plugged into. And now it'll be able to know, okay, well, this is the route that I need to take to get to this thing. Or this is the route that I need to take to get to the state store, or to the service bus, or to one of my bindings. Maybe I'm talking to Twilio or SendGrid or whatever the case is. Doesn't matter, right? Like I don't have a hard dependency on that thing. I do have a hard dependency on Dapr a little bit. But again, I'm just talking HTTP, right? I'm not doing anything magic or special there. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? Okay. So this is kind of what the sidecar model looks like. Like for every one of those components, we'll talk about what those components are. For any one of those components, there is a very well-defined HTTP endpoint, right? If you're using gRPC, there's like protobuf files for all of these too as well, right? But there's a very well-defined endpoint for all of these. So if you kind of read this really quickly, and you're looking at, how do I invoke a service on the other side, right? I have, 3500 is like the default Dapr port. Obviously, you can change that if you wanted to. But it says, I want to invoke the card service. And on the card service, there's a method called new order, right? And that's it. If there was a different service and a different method on that service, well, you just change it. You know what I mean? But again, all I'm doing is that I'm just sending data over HTTP. Obviously, you could send your JSON payloads or your XML payloads if folks are still sending XML payloads, whatever you want, right? Like stuff in the contents of your message, and then just send it over the wire. And Dapr will go ahead and deal with that for you. If you look at the second line, you can see there's also a well-defined contract for state and for publishing messages and for getting secrets, right? Secrets as in like, hey, I have things that are inside of, I don't know, Azure Key Vault or HashiCorp Vault, right? Like, how do I get my configuration information? Right, like there's well-defined HTTP endpoints for all of these things. So again, like my dependency is on the protocol, right? I'm focused on HTTP. I don't need to know what the implementation of the thing is. I just need to know that Dapr is going to go and get it for me, and I'm just going to bring it back, right? Again, here's an example of what PubSub kind of looks like, right? PubSub is kind of interesting because with Dapr and the way that it does PubSub is that it supports the competing consumers pattern, if folks are familiar with that. Like, I have one queue or one thing that's like collecting work, and now I can scale out by having multiple instances of it, pulling items off the queue and getting that work done, right? It's kind of like how we do load balancing, if you think about it that way, right? Like, if I want to scale out, I just add more instances, right? Now I'm able to pull items off that queue and process that work a lot faster. But again, my application is talking to Dapr. And then that service on the other side that's listening is also listening to Dapr, right? I don't care that there's Redis in the middle. We can swap it out or we can change it with configuration. It could be whatever it is. But like all I care about is that I'm going to use this publish endpoint that's here at the bottom. Does this thing work? Oh, it does work. Haha. All I care is that I'm going to use this publish endpoint. I'm going to be sending messages over the wire. And then at the other side, it's going to be listening. And it's going to be like, OK, well, I'm receiving data. Like, what does this thing kind of look like? OK. From the .NET perspective, like this is an example of like what the Dapr client looks like. Now, for my demos, I'm not going to use the Dapr client, mainly because I just want to show you that you don't have to do any, SDKs or NuGet packages. But that's also an option that's available, and if you want to take a look at that, it's inside of the docs as well. Let's talk about observability real quick. So I mentioned, when we think about observability, we think about telemetry, right? We think about logs, we think about metrics, we think about traces, right? Like, what am I doing? How many times am I doing it? Like, what's the path am I taking to get to the thing that I'm trying to do, right? And if something fails, if something breaks, if something doesn't work, how do I get that information, right? Like, what am I going to look at? Or what do my logs say? What do my metrics say? What do my traces say? How can I diagnose the problems that I'm starting to have, right? And so, a long time ago, there was this thing called open census. They eventually turned into open telemetry. I'm not going to go into the story behind that, but again, the whole point of this is, again, what we have now is a standard compliant way of getting this information in and out of our applications, right? And now these are all the different folks that support it, right? Like, so we have Prometheus. Prometheus is usually this thing that does metrics. You know, Jaeger for tracing, Zipkin for tracing, and again, Datadog and New Relic and App Insights and all of these other things that support OpenTelemetry. Now, this is not, this right side that you're looking at, that's not a Dapr thing, right? But because we implement an open standard, we can plug into all of these different tools. The only thing your app, again, needs to know about is just how to talk to Dapr. We'll figure it out for you, right? And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And now, if folks haven't used Zipkin or App Insights or anything like that, what we end up getting is something that kind of looks like this. This one's kind of tiny, but if you look at that big one over there, you can see I'm able to look at that open telemetry information, and I can see the different services that are inside of my application and how they talk to each other, right? If the request starts at the calculator front end, how does it go all the way down to the bottom to like some of the other services that exist inside of your topology for your application, right? I don't know if any of you have ever tried to draw this yourself before writing your applications. It's not fun, right? So again, this is why we rely on some of these standards to kind of help us do some of this stuff. All right, so that's pretty much all I want to talk about. Let's look at some demos. I feel like I've been talking all day today. Let's do this. I am going to swap over to, so I use Writer for a lot of stuff. Yeah, I'll use Writer for .NET. I like Writer. Let me know if this font is not big enough or anything of the sort, and we could always sort this out. All right, so I want to show you a demo. So is everybody familiar with containers and Docker Compose? Is that something that you want me to talk about? OK, I'll talk about it. So what I have in here is I have an app, and I'll even show you how I like to organize things a little bit. So I have an app, and I have 2 Docker Compose files. The purpose of my Docker Compose files is really so that I could like mimic my infrastructure locally on my machine. That's how I use it, right? So my one Docker Compose file that I'm going to show you here, it has a lot of different services that I'm going to use just to spin up on my machine to like create the environment, like if I'm faking what production kind of looks like, right? So inside of here, I have, you know, you don't need to see what's inside of this, but this is Mongo, I have Redis, I have RabbitMQ, I have Zipkin. I also have this thing called Seek. I like to use Seek for like log aggregation, right? Like where do all my logs go and how can I start querying them and using them, right? So now I have all of the things that I consider to be infrastructure in one Docker file, right? Another reason I do that, only solely for like organizational purposes, and again, removing noise out of my space, is that like I don't have to, I have much shorter Docker files or Docker Compose files when the infrastructure is in one place and my app is in another place, right? Because again, I have no app stuff in here. Now that's already up and running. This is where my app code kind of lives, right? And so what you're noticing inside of here is that, and I'm going to collapse some of these things, and this will probably make more sense if I do that. As I collapse some of these things, what you'll notice, I have 2 services in here. I have a web front end. It's built with Blazor and Web API in the back. And then I have another process that's the order processor, right? So in the front end, what I'm going to show you is that I have this application, and I'm going to be able to like buy things. And then after like the money's confirmed, because you know I work at Stripe, I have to talk about collecting money. After we've bought things, I'm going to send a message to the queue. I'm going to drop it in the queue, and then something is going to be in the back. It's going to pull the message off the queue. It's going to do all the things that we need to do for fulfillment, right? When you think about fulfillment, you think about, OK, I got to ship the thing. I got to pull it out of inventory. I got to email people. Like, stuff has to happen, right? But some of those things are not like, I can't do that in a minute. Like, those things take a long time to do, right? So I don't want to have that running in process. I want it to run out of process. If I think about running things out of process, I think about messaging. I want to send it somewhere else, and you'll do what you need to do, and my front end stays responsive, and my customer is able to keep doing the things that it likes to do. OK, great. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Actually, I'll debug this. Right? And so what I have here is that this is just like a really simple configuration for how you run Docker Compose files inside of Writer. I'm going to go ahead and hit the debug button. Notice what we have here, too, which is kind of cool, and I kind of like this, is the fact that I have 2 separate things for my infrastructure and my app, right? So if you look at this, it moved on me. I don't like it when it does that. When you look at this one, right, like this is all my infrastructure stuff. These are all my infrastructure containers that are running on my machine, right? Mongo, Rabbit, Redis, Seek, Zipkin, right? We never need to look at that again. These ones are all red because these are all running in debug. But again, the point that I want you to see and the point that I'm always going to emphasize, for every instance of your application, you're going to have an instance of Dapr, right? Like the sidecar that's running next to your application, right? So again, I have the order processor, I have this web thing that's running. Oh no, dum dum dum. Of course that doesn't work. All right, let's see if it actually does work. Of course it does not. Let's see, is this running? It looks like it's running. Maybe it's lying to me. Let's see if it's lying to me. All right, I'm going to head over to the browser. I was running this earlier today. Let's see, does it work? Does it work? Does it work? It's working, fantastic. So this is what the front end looks like, right? Like, so imagine I have like an events website, right? I'm selling tickets, I'm advertising different events. This is kind of what it looks like. I'm going to click on the thing, right? And I want to buy this ticket, okay? Sure. I click on the thing, I'm going to go buy this ticket. I'm going to use Stripe Checkout, right? Stripe Checkout is like our self-hosted checkout experience for compliance reasons. You don't want to process credit cards on your machine. You process it on our machine, and we handle PCI compliance and things of that nature. But the important part is that what I want you to see is that I'm running in a container. I've just now sent it over somewhere else, right? And then when it's done, I'm going to get a webhook event that's going to come back to my machine. So let's go ahead and put some stuff in here real quick. And then we'll go back to why this is important for Dapr. This is not my real phone number, so if you call it, I don't know who's going to answer the other side. So don't do it. It's not a good idea, right? 4242, for most payment processors, that's like the success card. If you want to test like successful card transactions, just type 424242. That's not a Stripe thing. It works with a lot of different people. You can try it out and see what happens. Right, 4242. I'm going to put this in. I'm going to hit pay. It's going to do some stuff. Okay, well, that's not what I was expecting to do, but okay. And now you should have your order somewhere inside your machine. Let me go ahead and show you again what some of this code looks like for it to work. Okay, well, there you go. It hit my breakpoint. I was like, why didn't it hit the breakpoint? Well, it looks like it did. Right? So now what you're seeing is that now, remember, I'm running this thing inside of a container, right? And I'm running it inside of Docker Compose. What's happened now is that I have dropped that message inside of RabbitMQ, right? And it's now been picked up by this thing that's going to handle fulfillment, right? And then, as again, if you can kind of go through this, you can see what it does. It's going to read the event off. The session service is pretty much just like another service that's going to give me information about the order, right? And then I'm going to log order received. And then I have this thing called a messenger. I have two implementations, either SendGrid or Twilio, depending on like what the setting is. I'm either going to send you a text message or I'm going to send you an email. And that's do some pattern matching, and that's what that does. Okay, so go ahead and run that. Stop. That's not what I do. How do I keep running this thing? It is, oh, here we go, debug. There we go. Keep running that, and in a second or two, I should have an email in my account that would show me that I have now processed that order. Do I have it? Do I have it? Do I have it? Yes, great, fantastic, right? Your order has been processed. All right, so now you've seen what the app looks like. I'm gonna take a step back now, and I'll show you how this all gets configured and how it gets wired up. Like, where does the Dapr part of it actually come into play? Okay, so I'm gonna close a bunch of these tabs and things of that nature. Now, Dapr is mostly like a configuration-driven type framework, right? So if you wanna know how do I plug in my things together, well, the first thing that we do, so we have this thing called like the Dapr. So Dapr is all configured in YAML too, by the way. So if folks don't like YAML, I'm sorry, there's a lot of YAML in here, right? So this is like the main Dapr configuration. So in the main config, we could set up things like tracing, we could set up scopes, right? When you talk about scopes, we talk about like which ones of these containers could access what services, right? We could set up metrics, and we set up all other types of things in here. What I'm doing inside of this one, really all I'm doing is that I'm sending some information to Zipkin. And I have that's just like the endpoint for Zipkin. That's the address and the port for it, right? I'll show you what the Zipkin endpoint looks like in a second. But once I do that, now my metrics are just going to Zipkin. My OpenTelemetry stuff is going to Zipkin. This is not in my app, right? Like this is inside of Dapr, it's configured over there. If I wanted to change it to go to somewhere else, then I just change the configuration, right? But then now my whole app is instrumented, right? The OpenTelemetry stuff just kind of takes care of itself from a tracing perspective. let's look at some of the other stuff that we have in here. So I mentioned before, like I was using RabbitMQ. Well, how does that get wired up, right? Inside of this folder that I have called local, my local folder has a bunch of Dapr component specs. All the specs are written in YAML. Told you there's a lot of YAML in here. But for every spec, I am able to specify, well, what's the metadata I need to know how to use this particular thing, right? So for RabbitMQ, well, all I really need is the connection string, right? And you can see here I have this thing, demo, username, password. Don't use demo, as your username and password. But, you know, I'm doing it here. Demo, right? And then this is the name of the container and the port that it's running on. And this is running locally on my machine. Because again, remember I had that other Docker Compose file with all those infrastructure services, and it's running inside of that. And then any other type of setting that you need to run inside of this. Now, the first thing people usually ask me when they see this stuff is like, how do I know how to fill this out? I'm going to give you a secret. Like, you can't tell anybody. I copy and paste all of these all the time. That's honestly all I do. I go to documentation, I find the thing I want to use, I copy paste it, and I change the value, and then I move on with life. Simple, right? That's all we got to do, right? Let's take a look and see what the Redis one looks like. The one for Redis doesn't look that different. Again, I have the name of the component, right? The metadata spec. One of the things you might notice that's a little bit different inside of here is instead of me having the password hard-coded in my YAML file, because some of y'all might be like, I don't want passwords in my YAML file. Like, that seems very insecure. My DevOps folks are probably going to shoot me, right? Hopefully they don't shoot you. But again, if you want a more secure way of handling that, well, why don't we use secrets, right? We have secrets inside of Dapr, and that's one of the components I told you that it knows how to use. So when we think about these secrets, what you notice I'm doing inside of here is that I'm saying, hey, Redis password, that's the name of the property. I want you to get the name, I want you to get the value for this property out of the secret store, right? And so here I have a secret key ref, you know, the name and the key of that particular secret, and Dapr will kind of just figure it out and go get it. Notice here at the bottom, I'm letting it know what secret store I want you to use for this particular component, which kind of gives us some flexibility, right? Because you can have different components, and you might want those secrets to come from different places. You might have, for whatever reason, different ways that you want to separate out your network, the way that you want to have your things structured. Maybe they're all running in different environments, right? Again, you can pull those secrets from different places. Now, I'm using something called a local secret store. And again, as you can imagine, this is also configured in YAML. And the local secret store, this is only for testing, allows you to specify a local file that you could get those secrets from. Again, only for testing. Please do not put this in production, okay? But what I'm saying here is that, hey, I want all of my secrets inside of this JSON file. And so when Dapr kind of boots up, it's going to say, okay, you said you have a local secret store. Where's the file? I'm just going to load all of these things. And now you have the ability to programmatically ask for them, right? Again, remember we showed you like there was that HTTP well-defined URL, right? Like I can use that secrets URL and be like, give me stuff, right? Go give me the secrets that live in the space. If you kind of want to see what this looks like, there's no YAML in this one because this is a JSON file. But as you can see here, like simple, key value, right? It's just JSON, right? And I can load this up into my thing, and now I can start referencing it in some of my different components inside of my Dapr file. Okay. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? Okay. Now, why don't I show you what some of this other stuff looks like? Now, I'm going to pop open my Docker thing. So this is another cool tool I like to use. So this is Docker Desktop. But did you know Docker Desktop has this thing called extensions? Have you all ever used extensions in Docker Desktop? No? So in your Docker Desktop, on Windows, Mac, it's all the same. Right? On the left side, you have this thing called extensions. You can add extensions, and there's a lot of cool stuff in there. One of my favorite extensions has nothing to do with Dapr, but I'm just showing you as a FYI. It's called Portainer. And Portainer is really cool because it gives you a very easy way to kind of like poke into your environment. You know what I mean? And so I could log into my containers, I could look at my logs, I can see what containers are running, and I could shut stuff down and spin them up. So it makes it really easy for me to use. Why am I talking about this? So I want to click on my local environment. Remember I had those two Docker Compose files? One was for infrastructure, one was for my app, right? So that's what I'm showing here. Infrastructure, app, right? Two different Docker Compose files. Now what I want to see is, I want to look at the Zipkin service, right? And I should be able to, where's the thing? Here we go. It's on 1494.40, was it 94.11, right? Let's go ahead over there and see what that looks like. Localhost 94.11. Okay, again, locally running on my machine. I can't control the font size of Zipkin, I'm sorry, right? But I'll zoom in a little bit. Even though it's super blurry, I get it. I can't control it. This is not my UI design. I did not do this. I apologize. I'm sorry. But essentially what I want you to recognize is that because I've orchestrated this thing with OpenTelemetry, it's able to know, oops, this thing says website in case you can't read it, and that one says order processor. Two processes I had running inside of my environment. Because I've orchestrated this thing with Dapr, now I'm able to pull those traces out, and I can go inside a Zipkin, and I can see not only what are the services that are in my environment, but also the direction that they're going to. So if you kind of squint a little bit, you might notice that there's like a little dot that like every 30 seconds, so, oh, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes, right? It's showing the direction that your data is flowing in, right? It's going from the website to the processor. But how did it know that, right? Because I'm going from my website to Dapr. Dapr is going from Dapr to AMQP into RabbitMQ. And then on the other side, I have my order processor that's listening to Dapr, which is also using AMQP. So how does it know that, right? It's using OpenTelemetry. Right? It's using those trace headers and all those other things that are part of the spec to be able to figure out, well, what direction am I going in? Where's it going and how is it kind of working, right? If we zoom out of this a little bit, let's take a look at the traces, right? I'm going to look for service name website. That's enough. That's fine. And I could look and see what's really happening in some of my show. Could you just show the thing? There we go. Right? I could look and see how the information is flowing back and forth. Again, this is not a very detailed one because this is only one message, right? I drop a message in the queue, and it goes from the website over to the order processor. The order processor does some stuff, and that is the end of the trace, right? One message, boom. But then now I can see what's happening in here. What do you think would happen if I had more services orchestrated in here? Or what do you think if I had more components orchestrated in here? That's not a trick question. You can answer that one.
See all the additional steps in the trace.
I'd see more steps in the trace, right? What if this was broken down and I had order processor, and then underneath it I had email, inventory. What else do people do when they process orders, and shipping? They would just all line up at the bottom, right? And I could look and I could see how long is it taken in each place. I can see what happens in what order. I can see where they're going, right? But again, the whole point that I want you to recognize here is that none of this is in my code. I didn't do this. I have no OpenTelemetry APIs inside of my application. I have no RabbitMQ SDKs inside of my application, right? All of this is happening inside of Dapr. So if I were supposed to show you my my CS proj file, right? Sure, I have stuff for Stripe.net. I have stuff in there for Seek because I'm sending stuff over there. I have Serilog logging in there. I have nothing in here that says anything about Dapr or RabbitMQ or OpenTelemetry or AMQP anything, right? The point that I'm trying to drill here with this is the fact that it keeps your dependencies very lean, right? It keeps your dependencies lean. You don't have to depend on a lot of extra stuff. You can focus on the things that you care about, which is actually building your application and writing code, okay?
Where'd the reference come from for the messaging system, though?
That's a good question. I'll show you that right now. Okay, so how do I send these messages, right? I'm sorry, you had a question too, sir? Oh, this driver? Okay. No, it's not. Okay, so the original version of this app, this is like artifacts. This is what do you call it?
Legacy?
This is like old code I need to delete and throw away, right? So the original version of this app used Mongo, and I would pull my product data out of Mongo, right? Since I updated the app and I'm using Stripe, it's just pulling the product data out of Stripe. So this actually doesn't do anything. But if you wanted to, you could use it. Yeah, this is just artifacts. But I think that also brings up an interesting question because, and I'll get back to the messaging thing in a second. It brings up an interesting question because folks usually ask me, okay, if one of the tenets of Dapr is state storage, why do I need a database, right? Why do I need a database if this thing can plug into SQL Server and it can plug into MongoDB, it can plug into Redis, it can plug into Cassandra, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The state store that's inside of Dapr is a key value store. It is not meant for complex queries. It is not meant for writing joins and probably a lot more complex processing that you probably want to do. It is a key value store. It's a dictionary, right? What happens is that the implementation of that dictionary varies. You can change it. It could be Redis, it could be Mongo, it could be SQL Server, whatever you want it to be, right? But it's just a dictionary, right? It's input, output. Give me the give me the data that exists on this index and return it, right? So my answer to that now is like, okay, well, if you know you need to do something more complex, and particularly if you're writing queries, you're probably writing queries for a very specific system. If I write a MongoDB query, it's not going to work on SQL Server, because that query is specific for that implementation of that data store, right? So now when you look at Dapr, and folks are like, oh, wow, well, you have all of these different things that I could do. Well, you don't have to use them all, right? The thing is, like, you have to pick the thing that makes sense for you. Again, we have state stores, we have secrets, we have service discovery. If you just want to use one, just use one. And then for the rest of it, you could figure out like what makes sense for you. Maybe you need a very specific API with very specific features, and you can use those instead. Or maybe you could use all of Dapr. Whatever you want to use, right? Like at the end of the day, it's up to you, and it's your choice what you want to do. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Now, go back to Aaron's question. He was asking, well, how do I publish the message? Okay. Now, are most of you folks .NET folks? Yeah? Okay. All right. So I have an HTTP client inside of here, right? And when I go back into my webhook handler, so remember, after I hit that checkout button, I'm going to get a webhook that's going to say, my order is completed, right? And then what I want to do is I want to publish a message on the queue, and I'm going to have the message processed out of process. Yeah? Okay. So now I have a webhook handler. You know, all it's doing here is it's saying, okay, I got an event. If the event is session completed or session, async payment succeeded, pretty much like if your check clears, right? I want you to come down, and I'm going to use the HTTP client factory, and then I'm going to serialize the message, and I'm going to publish it. Remember I showed earlier when I was on the slides that I have a very well-defined URL, right? Here's my URL at the bottom, right? v1 publish. What I'm giving here is the name of the pub sub thing, which is RabbitBus, right? Where did that name come from? Name came from here. It's in the configuration, right? That's when the name came from, right? RabbitBus, and then this is the name of the topic that I'm publishing to, okay? So the name of the bus, or the name of the messaging thing, not the implementation, but the name of it, and then I give it the name of the topic that I want you to publish to. And you can imagine on the other side, I'm listening to that topic from my order processor, right? The order processor is going to say, okay, I'm listening to these things. Like if you have anything that comes into this queue with this particular name, I want you to set it to me. Okay, so now what does this look like, right? Like what does this HTTP client factory look like? Right, well that is configured inside of my program.cs file, right? And pretty much this is what it looks like, okay? All it is I'm just giving it a base address. Nothing special is happening here. Remember I told you that default port for Dapr is 3500. And because Dapr is running as a sidecar, Dapr 99.9% of the time is running on localhost, right? Separate process running on localhost. So what does that mean for like network security and all that extra stuff? You don't have anything to configure. You're just talking to your cousin like right next door, right? All I'm doing is I'm just sending stuff to the other side, right? But again, because Dapr runs in that model that I was telling you about, it's able to find out like where everything else is inside of the network, right? It's able to create that picture of the network topology for me. It's able to know what components I have set up, and then it could pull it up and it could spin them up, and I can know what exactly are the things that are available. So technically, this is all you need to run Dapr in .NET.
What does the receive side look like?
What does the receive side look like? Sure, I love these questions. These are amazing questions. All right, what does the receive side look like? All right, so I'm going to open the processor, pop open controller. I'm old-fashioned. I like using controllers. This minimal API stuff is different. Okay, there's two things you need on the receiver side. One, you have to have an endpoint that lets Dapr know, well, what are the topics that I want to listen to, right? So this is a controller. This is a Dapr controller, and I have a subscribe endpoint. When you spin up Dapr, when you spin up the sidecar, it's going to know, okay, well, this is the app that I'm associated with, and it's going to ask it some questions. One of the questions it's going to ask is, okay, well, if you want to subscribe to pub sub, like, what do you want to listen to? Right? And so what I'm returning here, I'm returning an array. This payload thing is technically an array of key values, right? And I want to know the name of the pub sub, rabbit bus, right? The thing that I had here, the topic, and the routes, right? When this topic comes in, where do I send it? And then here at the bottom, here's where I send it, right? I have a /fulfillment endpoint. So when the topic comes in on order fulfillment, it goes to the fulfillment endpoint. That makes sense, right? And then now all I'm doing is that I'm reading the request off of, HTTP context, and I'm going to do some stuff with it. Now, something very special here that's happening that you may or may not have noticed, but like I'm using something called cloud events. Have folks ever heard about cloud events? One person? Okay. Two people? Okay. So cloud events is, we like standards, right? Like standards is a thing that we always want to do. And then we create another standard, and now we have two standards. So with cloud events, essentially it creates like an envelope for us to have like a very compliant way of sending messages back and forth. Like if you think about a couple of years ago when folks were building REST applications, and everyone had like a different way of wrapping the message. Remember that? And we all had different content types, and all this types of stuff was happening. But all we really cared about was the data in the middle, right? Well, what Cloud Events does is that, well, it gives us another one. And it gives us another way to wrap our messages. But the cool thing about this is not necessarily tied to HTTP. Right? So if I wanted to publish this on a message queue, I could use Cloud Events. If I wanted to use HTTP or gRPC or anything of the sort, I could use Cloud Events. Right? And it gives us a very well-defined contract of sending messages back and forth. Messages, not HTTP requests, not AMQP messages, messages in general. Okay?
Where
Now,
does this Cloud Event find? Is it in the library?
there is a library that I pulled up. I could show you there you go, right? So I pulled in a package to use Cloud Events, mainly because I wanted to show you what Cloud Events looks like. But this is not a Dapr thing, right? This is the thing. This is another project that's contributed and supported by the CNCF, right? The Cloud Computing Foundation folks, right? And again, it's just a way for us to be able to send these messages back and forth. Now, it turns out that as we're doing pub sub with Dapr, it's going to use Cloud Events by default. You can turn it off if you want to, but by default, this is what's going to happen, right? So now inside of my, my controller, pretty much all that's happening here is like I'm just deserializing the Cloud Events, right? I'm pulling the data out of like the data thing inside of it, right? What's inside of my data? Well, inside of my data, I have the ID for my session, my checkout session. And so now I'm like, okay, this checkout session is finished. What was in the checkout session? What did I buy? Who bought it? How much money did they spend? Yada, yada, yada. And after I pull out that session information, that's how I'm able to decide, okay, well, do I want to send them a text message or an email, right? But the important part, at least when it comes to Dapr and the messaging, is really just, well, it's really just this part, right? Like, I want to know what's inside of this data object. You know what I mean? And that data object that's inside of here was really just this, right? That's all that was in there, right? So I sent it on one side. I pull it out on the other side. Now, like I said again, like I only did that for the demo. You don't have to use it. You can turn on a switch, and then you can just get raw objects back. And you can use regular model binding and whatever you want to use. Pull out your JSON serializer of choice and use it. That's totally fine. But again, I'm showing you this because, again, standards, right? We're making use of standards so that regardless of whatever happens on the other side, we know what the message looks like, right? Have you ever tried to like interop between different services that are written in different programming languages, and the expectation on the other end is different because there's no standard as to what the message should look like? Because everyone has a different opinion about what a message is, right? Like, where does the data live? Like, if this was paging, like where does the paging information go? Where does the metadata go? How do I know who is it coming from, right? Like everyone has a different idea of what that structure is. With cloud events, I have a very consistent structure. And since Dapr supports all different types of programming languages, if this was Python, I could pull out cloud events using Python. If it was Go, I could pull out cloud events using Go. I have a very consistent idea of what this message coming out at me looks like, right? This is also how, yeah. Question?
Yeah, Dapr lives as a sidecar,
Sure.
and you can go ahead and do this. And it seems pretty easy to integrate into your code. What if you have someone else's product and you want to stand Dapr up on top of it? Can you do that?
On top of their product? What do you mean?
Yeah, is there a way to hook it into, say you have another product that exposes an API or an SDK, can you hook Dapr into that API or SDK? Is there any way to sideload it that way? Sorry, I asked the hard question here.
No, that's a good question. No, I think, so I guess so when, I'm trying to understand the question. So if you wanted to load Dapr into it, I'm guessing that means that, so you want Dapr, you wanted
Say
that
I
application
run a
to,
local version of GitHub on my computer.
sure.
GitHub exposes APIs.
Mhm.
Can I run Dapr next to that GitHub and hook it into GitHub's APIs?
I mean, you could. You could. I think you could, but then I think the important part to recognize is that you'd have a limited set of functionality.
I'm sure, but
But you could do it.
Still provides some interest in.
It does. And let me show you how I'll do it. I'll show you how you do it. So this is the important part, right? Like, this is the command line command that you would run if you wanted to run Dapr on, I don't know, on the command, right? So there's a Dapr process, right? And your app will have to be running first. So let's say your GitHub thing is running first, right? You'd spin up a Dapr process and you just tell it, hey, app ID GitHub, this is the port that it's running on. And then now you could just start sending requests to it.
So does Dapr
And that'll work.
As a proxy to the messages come to Dapr that it then relays to the app and then back?
Right, so it'll come to Dapr and Dapr will relay it. Now your app is not Dapr aware on the other side. But if you're talking about sending messages to it, sure, you could definitely do that if you want.
It's only one Dapr.
I'm sorry, what?
It's only one instance of Dapr is there.
You'd have one instance per instance of the thing that exists on the other side. If you have two instances of GitHub, then you'd have two instances of Dapr pointing to those two instances of GitHub, if that makes sense. But again, if you want to use any of those other features, it may not work. When I say may not work, like you're not going to get like messaging and stuff like that because now it's not subscribing to anything. You know what I mean? It doesn't know, it's not going to have state stores and all that other stuff because it doesn't know about it. But if you're just talking about using service discovery and using it to figure out where things are on your network, sure, you can do that. But that would be like the only thing that you would get out of it.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So, seems to me like the benefit of using Dapr for this sample is that you were able to introduce Rabbit as like a reliable delivery layer between these two web services without having to explicitly program against it there. That
Yeah.
one message went in, and then when Rabbit got that topic, it made the HTTP post call to your other web API. So that makes sense for doing sort of this event-driven like pub sub style programming. If you wanted to do like request and response, where I needed to go ahead and get a specific reply back from the other endpoint, how would I do that in Dapr?
Sure. So then what would we do is, I don't have the sample in here. So you can do request response with like our service discovery stuff. So the way that would work would be, and actually I think I'll just show it to you in the slides, super quick. Yeah, I'll just show you this in the slides really quick. See, if we think about, let's pop up this one, right? Right, so let's say service A needed to talk to service B, right? No message queue, no nothing, right? I just wanted to ask you a question and you give me an answer, right? What happens is that depending on the environment that Dapr sits in or stands up in, Kubernetes, Azure, whatever the case is, what it'll do is like that sidecar would automatically find the other sidecar. Assuming they're on the same network, they will just find each other, right? If you're on Kubernetes, it uses core DNS or something of the sort. If you're on the same network, like on my machine, it uses MDNS, right? Multicast DNS. But it has ways of finding each other. Now, once it's found each other, now my app has a name, right? Service A, hypothetically. And this app has a name, Service B. What I could do is I could say, hey, invoke service A method blah, right? This here is the name of the app, right? Remember I had that app ID? This here is the name of the routes. So if we're talking about web APIs, they could be /API/order/process, right? This part here that's at after method, that would just be the route. Like that will be the place that I want to send it to, right? So if you had, if you just wanted to ask me a question and I live on the other side, I'd send a message to that. Dapr would jump to the other Dapr. It would send it to that route, and then I just get the message back. Now, this usually happens, obviously there's some hops that happen. This is usually pretty fast because it's using gRPC, so it's binary back and forth, it's HTTP2 and all that fun stuff. And the performance is pretty decent. You know what I mean? I want to say the performance is pretty decent, particularly when we just talk about like hopping back and forth between things.
So stepping one step back out for a minute,
Yeah.
can I run Dapr as something outside of this sidecar model? Can I say, hey, I don't have access to the source code, but I also don't have access. Now I want to talk to public GitHub. Can I go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to host Dapr on my machine and have it discover the APIs and everything in the public GitHub, so I can have two Dapr instances on my machine talk to each other? One that's a local one,
I mean, you could, right? So once you set up that configuration and you point it at a thing, it'll just forward the message. It's like a proxy. If you think about like you're running a proxy, it's just going to forward the messages over. Obviously, if you forward the messages over, it has to fit whatever GitHub expects for you to send it, right? You can't just send it anything and then expect magic to happen. But like as long as it fits it, it'll work. So if you ask, hey, GitHub has like a GraphQL endpoint. Can I send GraphQL over? I mean, GraphQL is just posts, pretty much, right? Posts and like payloads, right? I could send the payload, right? Serialize the payload, send the payload, and then I could point this, like this endpoint, this instead of new order, this would say like invoke GitHub, let's say you call it GitHub method, and then the endpoints that you want to send it to. Inside of your payload would be whatever that GraphQL thing happens to be. And then you just get a response back. So you could do that if you wanted to.
If you can listen on like one API and send that to another webhook using Dapr.
Yeah, and like I'm saying, you could definitely do that if you wanted to.
Set that up so that Dapr's listening on API from Azure DevOps or GitHub and send it to something else like Monday.com or something.
You could if you wanted to.
Or other things using,
Yeah, you could if you wanted to. I saw a question in the back. Yeah?
Is there a philosophy on how much Dapr is looking to abstract? Like certain microservices patterns like transactional outbox or solid orchestration, are those things better left to the consumer, or is it looking to also have components for controlling some of those?
So you're asking how much abstraction it's trying to give you or how much abstraction you should
The
use?
philosophy of the project more or less. Like certain things might not be there. Like I know
Yeah.
transactional outboxing is not from Dapr right now. Like, is that something that you would consider like you
Adding?
want to be in Dapr, or is that something that's like it wants to stay away from?
I don't know. I would assume anything that we can abstract and have implemented in a non-platform specific way, like anything that's open, anything that's based on standards, like we can do it. You know what I mean? I'll give you an example. Like one of the things that they're trying to do now is like the configuration API is a new thing, as an example, right? Like configuration is a very generic thing. You know what I mean? I think streaming is another thing, right? Like data streaming is something that's going to be coming at some point, right? But again, like we can implement those on top of a lot of different providers. But again, based on your use case, because I'm always going to tell folks, make sure you do your testing. If you think that you writing framework or implementation specific queries or code is better for you, then you should do that, right? Because again, Dapr is very much of a use what you need and leave the rest kind of thing. Like you don't have to use the whole thing. So again, I guess my answer is it depends. Right? It depends how much you want to use. Yes, sir?
Is there feature parity across the various Dapr SDKs? So am I at a disadvantage for trying to use Dapr with Java versus Python or any other thing?
No. Again, because it's just HTTP. Right? You can use the SDKs if you want, but in the end of the day, it's just HTTP. I don't know how good the Java HTTP endpoint is. I don't write Java, I don't know. I'm going to assume it's pretty good. So you should be fine. Yeah? Any other questions? Okay, I got like 4 minutes, so let me run through these slides super quick so you guys can get out of here and get back to the rest of your day. All right, so we talked about this. We did a little bit of a demo. Kata. Kata is a really interesting thing. So when we think about where do I host Dapr? Right now, Dapr is on my machine, and it's kind of just hanging out inside a Docker Compose, right? But now there's some other things that we might want to do, right? I might want to host it in the cloud. I might want to host it again on Kubernetes. Kubernetes was like one of the first deployment targets for Dapr, right? Now there's this new container apps thing that Microsoft released a couple months ago, right? Maybe I want to host it in that. Maybe I want to use it in something like Nomad. Or are you folks familiar with Nomad? It's like a HashiCorp product, right, that allows you to do orchestration for different services, right? Maybe I want to run it in different places, right? And so now we're starting to think about what some of the stuff looks like. So one of the projects that first came out a little bit before Dapr to start enabling some of these things is Kata, right? Kata is a really interesting project that allows you to do scaling on your containers, like scaling on your processes, particularly when it comes to Kubernetes workloads. So what that means is that like, maybe I want to scale something based on the number of messages that are inside of my queue. Maybe I want to scale something based on the number of, things that are inside of the number of rows that are inside of my database, or whatever the case is, right? Like I have some type of scale rule, right? When I hit a threshold, I want you to spin up. When I'm below a threshold, I want you to spin down, right? And I don't want to do it manually because I'm lazy, right? And my time is best served doing something else, right? So this is one of the cool things that Kata does for us, right? It gives us some of that automatic scale up and scale down functionality, right? Again, cool thing about hosting Dapr, again, I'm doing this kind of right now. Like I'm doing Dapr locally, self-hosted mode, just on my machine. It's running MDNS. Again, it's finding its different instances and it's kind of working. But all this other stuff just kind of works too, right? The Zipkin stuff and the Redis stuff and pub subs and yada, yada, right? When we talk about pushing into the cloud, like now we could publish it over to Kubernetes. Right, and if folks are familiar with Kubernetes, there's Helm charts and there's all kinds of things that'll make it easy for you to get set up and run in this environment. But again, your code is not any different. Your code is not any different. Your Dapr configuration is not any different. It's the same thing. I could take the same thing that I have running on my machine, I could publish it to Kubernetes, YAML and all, and it'll look the same way when I put it inside of this environment. Now this is cool, but like, if you're like me, like, I had a very weird reaction. Every time someone said Kubernetes, I would itch a little bit. It would make me feel a little uncomfortable. And so I figured I needed something a little bit easier to make the path better for me in the way that I like to write code. And so recently they released this thing called Azure Container Apps, which is kind of cool. It's Kubernetes, Kata, Dapr, and Envoy kind of abstracted for you. It's kind of like if there was app service for containers, right? Like containers easy mode, right? Like what's the easy button? I just want to publish stuff and let's just make it work for me. And this is what container apps does, right? So it takes Kubernetes, Kata, and Dapr, right? And it kind of puts them together and it creates this really interesting package for you. So what I'm going to do is show you really quick. So I already have a published instance of Azure Container Apps. I'm glad I didn't choose to deploy this in front of you because this would have taken a long time. But when you run it, this is kind of what it looks like, right? I have a Container Apps instance. Right? In here, I can define my Dapr components. So right here, I just have my RabbitMQ, right? Does this look familiar? This looks like the thing I was running on my machine. Instead, this is running in outer space somewhere, or wherever Azure has its stuff, right? And then now, I have my two apps, right? I have my events app, and I have my events processor app, right? The thing that's listening for messages, and the thing that's publishing messages. It's just kind of living on the cloud and doing stuff. But again, I'm only talking over HTTP, right? So if I decided I wanted to show you what this looks like, again, it should look exactly the same. This has an external ingress. Ingress means I'm going to have information coming in, and I set that up. The other one does not have an external ingress. So that means that you can't hit it from the outside world, right? It's completely isolated and internal to my container environment. But again, if I click on this, real quick, we're going to see the same app. I'm not going to run it. You guys know what this does. It runs exactly the same way that it ran on my machine. It's the same containers that I have on my machine. I just put it here, right? The only thing that's different now is the fact that I'm running this thing called Cloud AMQP, right? If you guys have ever heard about it, it's just like RabbitMQ in outer space, right? RabbitMQ not on my machine, it's on somebody else's machine. And all I did was, I took the configuration string. You can't copy it. It has things there. I took the configuration string, and I added it to my Dapr configuration, right? And so now when I start clicking through this thing a little bit, where's the manager? There we go. Let's start clicking through this thing a little bit. You know, when you can see I have my connections. I have two connections, my processor, the thing that is listening, and my web app, the thing that's sending the message. And I have my queues and exchanges and all of this types of stuff. But the important part about this is that like I didn't create those. I didn't create this queue. I didn't create the RabbitMQ exchanges. I didn't create the channels or any of this type of stuff. Once I have this set up inside of Dapr, it just figures it out, and it does it for me. It would be the same thing if this was Redis. It would be the same thing if this was Kafka. It would be the same thing if this was like RocketMQ or ActiveMQ or any of those other options, Azure Service Bus or whatever, right? Again, I could have used Azure Service Bus because I'm in Azure, but I wanted to show you that it doesn't matter. Like, this is not an Azure thing. This is not a Microsoft thing. You could run it wherever you want. You could use whatever you want, and then hopefully the world just works for you. One more question? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, even while it's running, you could swap it out for Azure Service Bus,
I could swap it out, yeah.
compare costs, things like that.
Yeah, totally. You could swap it out. You could swap it out, and again, you saw my CS prod file, right? Like I have no dependency on the thing, so I could swap it out, and my app would just keep working, right? It'll keep doing the things that I expect it to do. Right. So, what are the things we did not talk about? Really quick, in like 10 seconds. Dapr has actors, right? A lot of folks ask, why would I use Dapr actors versus something else like Akka.net or anything of the sort? The only thing that I would tell people is like, one, like this is a virtual actor system, and this is also actors across different platforms, right? So if I need to have run actors for whatever reason between .NET and Java and Go, then that makes sense. Other than that, I'll probably just use Akka.net. But again, if I have a microservice system, when you think about microservices, we think about like different things, right? I might have some Python things and some .NET things and some Go things, right? If I need to be able to run actors and I need to be able to run processes across these different things, well, maybe this makes sense, right? And that's an option that you have there as well. I know another thing that's coming out hopefully pretty soon is like a new workflow engine. They're building a workflow engine where we could do persistent workflows, where you think about workflows as a thing that I could start doing some work, I could pause it, something might fail, like I'll spin up another actor or another thing, and then it'll kind of keep going, right? And then now I don't have to worry about like, where in the world is that process running? Like, who's doing it? Like, what's taking care of it, right? Like, it should be able to just handle that type of stuff for me. So that should be pretty cool as well, right? Now, resources. If you folks are interested in learning about Dapr, there's tons of docs. There's a roadmap that's up and that's available. Definitely recommend that you come over to the Discord channel. I'm always hanging on the Discord channel. Tons of folks are there. Lots of cool stuff that's happening. And then also the Dapr Twitter account. But other than that, I am way over time, so I'm going to stop. But if you all have more questions, I'm going to be outside. I'm going to be hanging out. And hopefully you guys try out Dapr. Right? Thank you.